Hello, my name is Mike Marshall and I'm going to be talking about some of the types of lamp in use in Roman Britain and how they were used. Amongst the many changes in material culture that followed the Roman invasion of Britain was the introduction of the oil lamp. This type of artificial light had a long history in the Mediterranean, but in pre-conquest Britain, lighting was largely based upon natural light, domestic hearth, and perhaps more portable sources such as torches. These seem to have been sufficient for most people's needs, and there is good reason to think that Roman oil lamps did not gain widespread acceptance in the new province. In recent years, research by Hella Eckhart has transformed our understanding of the social context of lamp use in Britain. She demonstrated that lamps were rare in the countryside and are very heavily concentrated on sites associated with the Roman army and in major urban centres which had strong continental connections. This may reflect the presence of immigrants and/or people whose cultural background had strong links to the wider empire and who were accustomed to using lamps to illuminate nighttime activities such as reading and writing, socialising and eating, and for whom lamps played a role in ritual practice. These same individuals often also had easier access to imported lamps and fuel, particularly olive oil, which was imported to Britain by sea in large amphorae. Sites where lamps are very common also often have Roman styles of rectilinear building, similar to those used in parts of the world where lamp use was more common. While oil lamps were deeply embedded in these very Roman styles of living, they must have seemed much less appealing to those who lived in the British countryside, often in roundhouses which were sufficiently lit by a central hearth, and where both lamps and lamp fuel were probably more difficult to get hold of. In Britain then, lamp use seems to have been very strongly associated with people who were actively seeking to adopt or sustain specific types of Roman lifestyle. In fact, the use of Mediterranean-style oil lamps in Britain seemed to have been a short-lived phenomenon, already beginning to decline by the beginning of the 2nd century AD. By the late Roman period, lamps had largely disappeared even within towns, being replaced by alternative light sources such as candles. For all these reasons, the identification of lamps in an excavation assemblage can tell us quite a lot about chronology, patterns of activity, and the cultural affinities of their users. By studying their supply and use in detail, we can better understand the social processes that underlie these bigger patterns and their impacts on the lives of individuals. Lamp typology in Britain tends to draw on the classification of Lerschke, based upon his work on the Swiss site of Vindonissa, and this is used in Hella Eckhart's recent provincial survey, published in 2002. But other catalogues, such as Donald Bailey's catalogue of lamps in the British Museum, are also very useful. In terms of both typology and function, it is useful to first divide lamps into two major families: closed lamps, where the top is covered, and open forms, where it is not and the interior is open. The body of closed lamps contained a liquid fuel, normally assumed to be olive oil. This was poured into the lamp through a filling hole in the centre of a concave or recessed discus. The discus will have acted like a funnel and helped to prevent spillage, but filling a lamp will still have been a potentially messy business. The size of the body determines how much fuel the lamp can hold, and therefore how long it could burn without going out or needing to be refilled. This varies significantly, and so recording lamp size can provide a useful indicator of how a lamp was used. These closed forms of lamp normally have at least one nozzle projecting from the body. Functionally, their most important feature is a large perforation where the wick sits, which often has sooting around it, but they often also have small air holes too. One wick hole is equivalent to one flame, and so multi-nozzled lamps will have had multiple flames, producing more light but also burning through expensive fuel more quickly. This may reflect high-status consumption practices or specific type of activity that required a lot of light. Handles are present on some, but by no means all lamps, and may give a valuable clue as to whether these were fixed sources of light within a room or used while on the move. Considering the presence of features such as handles, together with fuel chamber size and the number of nozzles, can help us to consider the practicalities of how lamps were used in everyday life. The most common groups of closed lamp found in Britain are ceramic picture lamps like these, and ceramic factory lamps like these. Picture lamps were the main form in use at the time of the Claudian invasion and mostly date to the 1st century AD in Britain. Factory lamps were introduced a few decades later and survived well into the 2nd century and occasionally later. Both are made in two-piece moulds, like this one. Picture lamps are named after the relief moulded designs found on the discus of most examples, for example this one showing a stag. Manufacturing technology is reflected in the objects themselves by their relatively thin walls, the presence of fingerprints and other marks on the interior, where the clay was pressed into the mould, and the tendency for lamps to break at the top of the wall along the mould seam. Examples of these moulds have been found in London and Colchester, but to judge by the ceramic fabrics, a high proportion of site finds are actually imports, made in Gaul and elsewhere in the Empire. The different designs reflect highly classical tastes and include images of everyday life, plants, animals, and sporting, mythological or religious scenes. As most lamps were imported though, it's hard to determine how much choice the consumer had, but at least where lamps were chosen for inclusion in votive deposits and graves, the choice of imagery is likely to have been deliberate. Typological subdivision is based upon the shape of the nozzle and the presence or absence of volute mouldings on its side. The most common types in Britain are first century volute lamps with angular nozzles like this, or rounded nozzles such as this one. The second major family of closed lamps found in Britain are the factory lamps. These became common by the Flavian period, and by the early 2nd century AD had largely replaced picture lamps. They differ in that they normally have a flat recessed discus and a distinctive externally beveled shoulder, with lugs and a raised rim around the discus edge. On typologically later examples such as this, produced from around the beginning of the 2nd century AD, this rim continues down an open nozzle channel and around the wick hole. Factory lamps frequently have makers' names in relief on the base, like this. Many commonly occurring names such as Fortis seem to refer to Italian potters, but the ceramic fabrics of many lamps actually indicate production in the northwest provinces. This might reflect potters who migrated north or opened branch workshops to take advantage of new markets, or even the unauthorised copying of a maker's lamps to produce new moulds. Occasionally the discus is decorated with a face or theatre mask, and the way in which this image devolves into a simple boss is one of the clearest indicator of the repeated copying of lamps. Factory lamps made in Italy, such as these three, were made from around AD 60, and the first examples seem to have reached Britain shortly afterwards. Early imports are indeed Italian, but Gaulish and German lamps are more common overall. Those made in the northwestern provinces tend to be slightly smaller and more frequently have handles, perhaps suggesting that they were tailored towards consumers who used the light sources differently. Factory lamps were also produced at several sites in Britain, particularly in London, where distinctive local variants are known. By the 2nd century AD, London was producing a particularly distinctive group of mica-dusted factory lamp derivatives. These tend to be small and are occasionally quite crude. This could indicate either that they were cheap products made by unskilled potters, or that consumers were no longer concerned whether their lamps were closely emulating Mediterranean prototypes. These local factory lamps are occasionally wheel-thrown rather than mould-made, and this might mark a point of connection or transition to a rarer group of wheel-thrown closed circular lamps, which were in use from the 2nd century onwards. These relatively simple and decorated later lamps are visually very different from the more elaborate early lamps. Mass-produced decorated picture lamps may still have been fairly cheap, but some rarer types of lamp are likely to be more expensive. These include ceramic lamps moulded into elaborate shapes, such as this foot wearing a sandal, and high-quality metal lamps, such as this hanging lamp from London. Metal lamps are rare, and were also probably much more expensive than ceramic examples. The second major family of lamps are the open lamps. As the body interior was not fully covered, these could also have utilised different fuels, perhaps including animal fat and tallow. While the most common forms have a nozzle, like this, we occasionally find patches of sooting on the rim of the body, suggesting that these types were also used more flexibly, perhaps including the use of multiple wicks in a single nozzle lamp. The most common examples are figure-of-8 shaped lamps, and these are found in both ceramic and metal. Metal examples are again rarer, and Eckhart's work has shown that these have a distinctive distribution, with lead-alloy examples in particular typically found on military sites in western Britain, in areas where lead was being produced, or on sites elsewhere which might have had military connections. Ceramic lamps are by far the most common, and these were produced and used in large numbers in urban centres such as London and Colchester, but they were also imported. These could be made in moulds or thrown on the wheel. Consideration of these different techniques along with the fabric can help us to understand the methods favoured by different workshops. Some distinctive open lamps can even be linked to a specific workshop, such as a group with decorated bases which were made at a workshop in Colchester. Another distinctive group are the wheel-thrown courseware lamps made by potters working in London and the surrounding area. These are generally much larger than imported open lamps and, if this is a reflection of consumer needs, might suggest differences in how open lamps were used in different areas. Other types of open lamp are much rarer, and the interpretation of some of them as lamps is open to doubt. These include globular wheel-thrown form, which have handles but no nozzles, and they rarely show signs of sooting and have occasionally been suggested to be other types of objects, such as inkwells or even bird feeders. Some of these rarer forms do seem to have been used as light sources, however, including this type with a central perforated socket within which the wick could have sat, or perhaps this same socket doubled as a candle holder. The study of these different types of lamps can help us to recognise differences in status or access to resources, and different strategies for using artificial light in domestic and religious spaces. Recently, there has been a move towards the use of experimental archaeology and computer simulations to better understand the visual impact of lamps, and other factors such as how quickly they burn fuel. Together with a detailed study of the objects themselves, such approaches offer new ways of understanding lamp use and the manner in which this imported technology functioned, evolved, and eventually declined in Roman Britain.